Hey guys, we're going to talk today for Technical Tuesday about single leg deadlifts. So there are several of you in the group who sometimes experience lower back pain. Some of that could just be chronic low back pain, meaning it's not because you're doing something improperly, but it does make it more important for you to make sure that when you're doing things that engage the musculature of your glutes, your hamstrings, and your low back, that you more than typical, or more than the normal person, or more than the person who does not really experience chronic back pain or intermittent back pain, it means that you should be hyper vigilant about your position when you're doing certain things. So typically, we work on single leg deadlifts as opposed to double-legged deadlifts when we want to make sure that we don't have biases between the right and the left leg, or the right low back musculature versus the left low back musculature. So it's really important that we're not always doing double-sided movements, so that we can focus on not overcompensating and leaning to one side, or overusing one side versus another. So I'm going to first demonstrate, without any weight in my hand, what the spine position should be like in a deadlift. And there are a lot of different variations on deadlifts. There are straight-legged deadlifts, which are pretty challenging for people who don't have really long, loose, mobile hamstrings. And so they tend to not be programmed very often because it's pretty challenging for people who don't have that flexibility, and it ends up being in their thoracic spine and in their low back instead of in their hamstrings and their glutes. So I'm going to demonstrate a regular bent knee deadlift, right? So the feet are positioned underneath the hips, right? I'm going to turn slightly towards you. What we don't want to do in a deadlift when we're on 2 feet is have too narrow of a stance, because it makes it more challenging to maintain a neutral spine when we hinge at the hips. So you want to think about looking at your hips and making sure that your feet are directly under. Slightly wider would be fine too. That gives you more stability. But at a minimum, your width should be where your hip bones are. Okay, once you've gotten your feet in this position underneath your hips, you shouldn't worry too much about either being completely dead center or slightly turned out. But we don't want to consistently do deadlifts with our feet turned out, because we end up working on our adductors a lot more, and that is its own exercise, which is called a sumo deadlift. But if we're trying to work on the posterior chain, the musculature of your backside, like hamstrings, glutes, and low back, we want to make sure that our feet are either straight forward or just ever so slightly turned out if we have hip mobility limitations. So imagine that you're either holding a bar or 2 dumbbells or 2 kettlebells. You want to initiate the movement first by slightly pushing the hips back, just slightly, and then you want, at the same rate, and this is the really important piece, meaning at exactly the same frequency, you're bending at the hip and at the knee equally. So that's what this looks like. Once you get to here, the hip hinge piece is done, and the remaining slide, or the movement of the weight that's in your hand, is only happening with a knee bend. So your hips don't flex any more than this. It's just that your knees bend more in order to get you further down. And then in the reverse, on the way back up, your knees are somewhat flexed. You're not in a squat, but they are flexed. And first, you're going to start first by going up with just extension at the knees a little bit. And then you're going to work on that same rate of extension, meaning your knees and your hips are going to open at the same speed, so that you get your hips stacked back up over your knees. I'm going to do this from the side so you can see. So first we initiate with a slight hips back position, and then hips and knees are going to bend at the same rate until we get to the place, and this is an important piece, the decision about when your hips stop moving is mostly about if you can keep a neutral spine. So if I get to here and I still feel like I have room, I can still slide forward because my back is staying neutral. But for some people, when they get to here, if they continue to only bend at their hips, not at their knees, what ends up happening is they've run out of room in their hamstrings, and so they tend to go like this, which is not really using their hamstring and their glutes. It's a thoracic curvature, and the shoulders are rolling forward. So if you can't be in this position at the bottom where you're pulling the lats down towards the hips, then what you should do is bend at the knee more in order to move the weight closer to the ground. Now that we've gone over what a double-legged deadlift looks like, now I'm going to stagger my stance the way I would in a single leg deadlift. What we want to do in a single leg deadlift is make sure that the leg that's in front is the dominant leg, right? So this foot can be touching the ground, right? But if we place more than just our tiptoes on the ground, we are likely to be transitioning some of our weight back into this foot, so that when we go into the deadlift, we are using knee extension and flexion to help us stand up, which is not what we want to do. So when you set up for your single leg deadlift, make sure that if you're keeping your foot on the ground, because you do have the option of doing it with your foot off the ground, that you're on your tippy toes, right? So that when you get to any point in the deadlift, you could lift that foot and you wouldn't fall over. So that's a good test. When you do single leg deadlifts, right? Here, can I lift my foot? Yes. Here, can I lift my foot? Yes. Here, can I lift my foot? Yes. Right? And I can remain balanced. That's how we know that the weight is actually on the leg that we're trying to challenge. Now, getting back to the upper body position and the pelvis, not just the upper body position. So what I often see when I program single leg deadlifts, if I'm teaching a class in person, is that the person will hold the weights in their hand and I'll say, okay, 10 deadlifts, and this is what will happen. And what's happening here is not just that the shoulders are rounding and that they're just coming down this way, it's that their pelvis is tucking. So this pelvic tuck is the bigger problem for somebody who experiences either chronic or like intermittent low back pain. What we want to do is imagine that you have to lift this leg up so that you create tension in here, so that when you're going down, even if your foot's on the ground, you're maintaining this neutral pelvis position as you reach for the ground. Again, if your hamstring is really tight on that front leg, you can, instead of continuing to go down with more flexion at your hips, you can just bend that knee a little bit more instead, right? So, I'm going to start on the right leg. Maybe you'll be able to see this more. So I start with my staggered stance. I'm on my tippy toe in the back. So at any point I could lift this leg and the deadlift is going to still work out, right? But if you don't have the balance for lifting the leg, just imagine that you are pushing this leg up, even if it's on the ground. So I'm going to play the role of a person with tight hamstrings. I hinge at the hip first, no weight on the back leg. I pull the shoulder blades back, retract the shoulder blades down and back, slight bend in the front knee. Once I get to the point where I don't have any more space in my hamstring, instead of rounding my back to get down, instead I'm going to bend the knee to go the rest of the way. And then in reverse, I'm going to straighten the knee back to that position. It's still bent, but I'm going to let off some of that flexion, and then I'm going to use my hips to drive forward. So think, hips back, hinge at the hip when there's no more room in the hamstring, finish with the knee bend to get closer to the ground. Extend the knee a little bit, then finish with the hip extension. Now, if I have really long hamstrings, I do have a lot of mobility in my hamstrings, I can make this mostly hip hinge where the knee bend that I start with is the same all the way throughout. Because I have the ability to keep my shoulders back, if at any point in the movement I feel like either because it's really, really heavy or because my hamstrings are too tight, if I start to get this position, then I know I either need to pull the shoulder blades back if I can, I need to unload the weight because it's too heavy, or I need to bend the knee more instead of trying to flex at the hip more. Here is one really good test, right? If you have one of these circular bands, you can step into the band with both feet, and you can get into your staggered foot position, right? And what I want you to think about is as you hinge forward, think about pulling the band up so that there's tension on the band the whole time. Now what happens is what I was saying before, is that the person doesn't think about this leg coming up or that tension remaining neutral here. So instead, when the band is around their ankles, if they tend to be one of those tail tuckers, this is what it looks like, right? The band never gets to full tightness, but when I try to pull the band apart, boom, I get that extension in my spine that I'm looking for, and now I'm activating the right muscles. So the foot being down and tucking my tail is where we don't want to be, and this active back position is where we want to be, right? So not here, but here.